This is going to be a presentation from me over the next 20 minutes before Jared comes in. And I do have a few PowerPoint slides as well to guide through with this presentation. So for people who aren't particularly familiar with me, my background is worked in the field of international politics and communications at a number of British universities. In a sense, my area of expertise crosses between communication and media studies and international politics. So, and I ended up as a full professor at the University of Sheffield, left Sheffield in 2019, and since then have been working independently, albeit also with a number of organizations, carrying on my research. And enjoying the benefits of not being sort of operating within the constrained environment of mainstream academia. Now, the case study that I want to run through over the next 20 minutes or so is the case of the working group in Syria, propaganda and media. And this is something which I've become, I guess in a way, become fairly well known for. Because of the controversy which has surrounded this research and where it ended up. And what I'll try and do, I can't tell the whole story, but I am at least going to try and give a clear idea of what happened in the early stages of my experience. And it is essentially, to give it a little bit of context, this is a case study in character assassination and smearing. This is one of the mechanisms, and I'll pick up on this at the end as I talk. This is one of the mechanisms which is used to constrain, to control, to dampen dissent within academia. Smear them, assassinate their characters. Now, just to start, take the story back to where it begins. I think it was approximately around 2017. That I started to entertain the idea of researching the war in Syria. And for me, this was a very logical step for me. I had spent quite a lot of years studying the Iraq war and British media coverage. I've been in charge of a large research council-funded project. And that sort of led to a lot of work on journal articles and a book, ultimately. And when that was complete, I then started to look at the intelligence that was used in the run-up to the Iraq invasion and the manipulation of intelligence. And that took me another 3 or 4 years working on that. And by about 2015, 16, I was starting to bring my head above water and say, okay, what are the big conflicts which are occurring at the moment that I should start to pay attention to? And I certainly, I became aware that the conflict in Syria, the war in Syria, was clearly major. It clearly had the involvement of multiple actors, including the British and American governments. And thought, well, this is going to be a right topic to study and try to understand, following on from having examined Iraq. And what I did with a number of colleagues in 2017, just moving to early 2018, was set up a working group on Syria, propaganda and media. And you can see there on the slide, that's from the website. This working group was essentially a group of us who were interested in a variety of aspects in relation to the war in Syria, but all of these aspects linking into questions of propaganda and so on. And we set this group up, and we had quite a large number of academics who agreed that this is a very interesting topic to study, so that they joined, and we set up a listserv. And one of the issues that we were interested in, because a number of colleagues in the working group had already been doing some work on this, was the question of the alleged chemical weapons attacks in Syria. Now, this had actually, although I wasn't aware of this at the time, this has been controversial all the way back in 2013. In particular, when there was a sarin attack in Damascus, Syria, a large number of civilians were killed. And at that point, there was a lot of controversy about who was responsible. The American and British governments blamed the Syrian government for it. Syrian government blamed it on opposition groups. Cy Hirsch, the American investigative journalist, famously challenged the US official line and said that this does not look as though it's the Syrian government who carried out this attack. So there's already been this large backdrop of controversy over the alleged chemical attacks going on in Syria. And some of us were going to look at this as part of the work of the working group. Anyway, we set up this website, and this is before we had really we'd published any formal pieces of material, any kind of research articles and so on. Almost immediately that we established a working group on Syria, we were being hit by smears and so on, and we'll get into some of the details of these. But straight away, and I got there on the left as a tweet there from Oliver Cam, who was a former Times columnist. He's not with the Times of London anymore. He'd actually sort of been on my tail since 2017, when he found that I had tweeted an academic study carried out by the University of Alaska Fairbanks regarding the World Trade Center 7 building destruction in New York on 9/11. And Oliver Cam was, as you can see there in the tweet, was chasing me down over social media, copying in my university, essentially trying to shame me for having cited this study and raised any questions about the official story in relation to 9/11. So he was straight on my tail back then. But then this was prior to this establishment of the working group in Syria Propaganda and Media. When we set that up, we immediately had Brian Whitaker, a former Guardian journalist, wrote a series of pieces on his blog site, essentially smearing us. Syrian propaganda propists, the propaganda professors, etc. And this was sort of alarming, I think, in the first instance, because we were quite genuine in our desire to research objectively and rigorously what was going on in the Syrian conflict and what was going on in relation to Western influence operations or propaganda operations. And to immediately be having articles being written about you, accusing you of being a sadist, conspiracy theorist, etc., and as people, as academics in Russell Group elite universities in the UK, this was disconcerting, and so on. Then early in 2018, and this was still prior to the working group having produced any material, any substantial material on the conflict in Syria. We were literally getting started, and so on. There was the what has now become quite well known, the alleged chemical weapons attack in Douma in Syria, which 43 civilians were killed. France, UK, and the US retaliated and bombed Syria about 7 days later. And this was controversial at the time, and as we'll see shortly, that this became even more controversial. And as this was happening, and again, so we set up the working group. We want to look at Syria. There's been this chemical attack in Douma, and that week, the week between the alleged attack having occurred and the bombing being carried out by the British, French, and Americans, I think I've been invited onto Sky News for an interview to talk about that. And I'd said, well, we need to wait for the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons to send in its investigation team, its fact-finding mission, and then we can sort of evaluate what might have happened there. And I seem to remember I was sat opposite someone from the Henry Jackson Society who was fiercely attacking me for doubting for 1 second that it was the Syrian government responsible for the attack. But as France, America, and Britain carried out military strikes on Syria a week after this alleged attack, there we were on the front page of the Times of London, apologists for Assad working in universities. Obviously, we had a little bit of forewarning of this because the journalists, Dominic Kennedy, who's already been mentioned, was in charge of the investigation, had been contacting us 2 days before these hit pieces came out. And this was pretty extraordinary. Again, the working group in Syria Propaganda and Media hadn't actually published anything at this point, of any substantial research pieces at this point. And there we were on the front page of the Times of London. And it wasn't just on the front page, there was an editorial as well. And there were a couple of other articles in the newspaper with pictures of some of us as well. An extraordinarily huge attack on a group of academics, pretty unknown, who were interested in researching Syria and the propaganda surrounding the Syrian conflict. This didn't deter us. However, what it did indicate to us that we might be onto something here. Why would so much energy be being invested in smearing us? Why would a group of academics end up on the front page of the Times of London with those kind of allegations being made, an editorial essentially asking for our jobs, asking for our heads on a plate? Why the noise around this? And of course, the suggestion to us was, or what it indicated to us was, that we were right over the target, that we were onto an issue which the authorities were trying to keep buried. Didn't deter us. Later in the year, after the initial fact-finding mission report was published by the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, who were tasked with investigating the alleged attack, we published a briefing note, and you can see there on the right-hand side of the slide. We published a briefing note essentially pointing out the kind of issues and questions which surrounded this alleged attack. Multiple issues, I won't go into the details, which indicated that the idea that the Syrian government had carried out the attack was very, very unlikely. But we were hit, and this just gives you an idea of the quantity of attack pieces. This is from a chapter from an edited book that I wrote, and listed there a whole array of newspaper articles from the Times and also from the Huffington Post, smearing us across the course of 2018, 2019. Again, so there we were. I was just a new full professor at Sheffield. I think probably my colleagues were beginning to wonder what on earth is going on here. This guy's on the front page of the Times newspaper. Multiple articles are being written attacking him and so on. But again, we persisted with this, and we thought, well, we're onto something here, and we're probably right over the target. Then, a year after the alleged attack in Douma, the fact-finding mission report from the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons was published. I think it was in March of 2019. And that was when things really became very, very interesting, because at that point, the questions which we had raised in one of our briefing notes about the OPCW's first report seemed to be essentially vindicated or verified by the fact that there actually emerged internal dissent within the OPCW about the investigation. And there was the leaking of an engineering study to my working group. Later in the year, a person from the OPCW familiar with the investigation was at the Courage Foundation panel and spoke to a number of eminent figures about what had gone wrong in the investigation. Peter Hitchens of the Mail on Sunday published stories, again, based upon people from within the OPCW. And there were also documents were leaked through WikiLeaks, which documented essentially what had gone wrong with the OPCW investigation. And to cut a long story short, essentially the investigation had been manipulated to point the finger at the Syrian government. And the manipulation had been so extreme, so severe, it had caused some people within the OPCW to put their hands up and say, we need to put a stop to this. This is wrong, and so on. And that was in 2019. So again, so just to recap, we're a group of academics. We set up the working group. We were looking at these issues and so on, being hit repeatedly by the Times of London, by the Huffington Post. Then come 2019, clearly with the fact that people from within the OPCW were essentially corroborating some of the questions we'd raised. Well, you would have thought that at that point it would be perhaps game over. in the sense of, well, clearly there's a problem and so on. I'm going to run through a couple of slides. So it became clear. I want to point out another sort of set of facts which emerged at that point and which became clear to all of us involved in this, was that not only were there people within the OPCW who were saying that the investigations had been corrupted, it also became apparent that there was, and I'll put this as gently as possible, an interface between the Syria operation, the Times newspaper, and the OPCW. And there's a little couple of snapshots of this here. You see there in the middle that Syria Civil Defense are the notorious white helmets, or the well-known white helmets. And below is James Lemessurier, who was the late James Lemessurier, who was in charge of the white helmets. And then there's Oliver Cam again popping up, talking about how the Times newspaper had identified me and other academics, and James Lemessurier had reached out to the Times and told the Times to keep on our case. So yeah, you have an interface between the Times and people. And just to be clear, the White Helmets and James Lemessurier were closely involved in the supplying of information to the OPCW investigation team. Okay, so a conflict of interest there. The other thing which became apparent at that point, on the right-hand side, you can see a gentleman who's Hamish de Bretton Gordon. It also became clear, partly because of his own admission in a couple of venues, that he had been involved with Times journalist Anthony Lloyd, gathering samples back in 2013 as part of, and it was an MI6 sample gathering operation. So this is a Times newspaper journalist, Anthony Lloyd, alongside Hamish de Bretton Gordon, in a location in Syria, gathering samples, which ended up with the Joint Intelligence Committee in the UK. So again, you have an interface there. The same newspaper which was aggressively attacking us as soon as we appeared on the scene, has, it transpired, been involved in these activities before. So again, lots of conflicts of interest there, and in a sense, confirmation of, or an explanation for perhaps why we were being hit so hard. We were onto something, and we were identifying serious problems with the OPCW fact-finding missions and the linkages back to UK government-linked operators, James Lemessurier, Hamish de Bretton Gordon, and so on, becoming more and more clear to see. So after all of that coming out, and I can't quite remember if this really did pass through my mind at the time, but I think I was kind of thinking, well, we're vindicated now, so this is, or it's above us, is what I used to say to some people, that sort of, this is being reported in the news. Peter Hitchens is covering this. There are OPCW persons who are speaking out, and their names are in the public domain, etc. That this is, we were right, and we can quietly carry on, and this issue can now become properly addressed. But what happened in reality was that there was simply a doubling down. There was a continuation of the smearing of us academics, even though by any reasonable measure we have been vindicated by the facts at that point in time. The smearing, of course, then shifted to the whistleblowers from within the OPCW, and Oliver mentioned Bellingcat in his presentation. Bellingcat was busily trying to trash the people, or the inspectors, who were named as having identified problems with the operation. And since then, there's been, really 2020, 21, 22, 23, a continual refusal by the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, and also the US, UK, and France to address all of the issues which the OPCW's own inspectors have raised. Quite remarkable. We're living in an era where you can get this level of transparency in terms of the facts getting out there and so on, but the authorities just double down and refuse to engage, and continue smearing as well. This thing is not ended. And I mentioned at the start, I was only giving a snapshot of this story because there's many more components to it, and I think David hinted at some of it in his presentation. Where are we today? Just to make clear, and this is a point I'll make sort of at the end of this presentation, where we are today is that, UK, US, and France continue to double down. The OPCW management continue to refuse to engage with their own inspectors. But we now have the Brazilian government has now raised on 3 occasions, once in the OPCW, twice at the UN Security Council, the need for the OPCW to address the issues raised by the inspectors. I'm working now with, you can see in the bottom right-hand corner there, that's Jose Bastani, Professor Richard Falk, and Hans von Sponeck, and we're working, we produce a 50,000-word report, which you can see on the left-hand side, which details everything that has gone on in relation to the OPCW's fact-finding mission in Syria. We continue to engage with governments. There are other sort of processes in the pipeline in relation to that. You can see our latest statement there and the web link there. So we carry on, or myself and Jose Bastani, Richard Falk, and Hans von Sponeck, we carry on sort of trying to get some kind of accountability and to get the issues raised by scientists from the OPCW properly addressed. So we carry on, but the authorities continue to double down and refuse to engage. But hopefully what this kind of sort of shows you overall, and again, to reiterate the point, sort of we were academics who had clearly stumbled upon a very corrupt process that was in play, a process which was corrupting the fact-finding missions, a process which ultimately was feeding into a strategic deception in relation to Syria, a strategic deception not completely dissimilar to what we saw with Iraq in 2003 with weapons of mass destruction. But with Syria, these were alleged chemical attacks which were either being staged or carried out by opposition groups and then getting blamed on the Syrian government. So a major strategic deception. We had stumbled upon it, and the response of the authorities was to attack and to smear us relentlessly. Even when we were vindicated, that continued. So this highlights, I think, sort of that technique and so on. So that's my first concluding point from the talk, is that I think the case of the working group on Syria and the case of all of the academics who've been involved in it and other people as well, this shows one of the principal mechanisms by which academics are silenced. You put them on the front page of newspapers, you smear them, you harass them over social media, and so on, and you try to intimidate them and humiliate them into being quiet. This isn't as coercive as what happened to David Miller at Bristol. He was fired, but this is towards the coercive end of the spectrum in terms of propaganda and management or stifling of dissent, in the sense that ultimately, and if you think of those tweets I showed earlier from Oliver Cam, and you think of those headlines that you can see from the Times and from the Huffington Post, I'm not even sure if it's correct to say the subtext, but the subtext of it is that these guys should be fired and so on. So this is about trying to end people's jobs in universities and so on. The third sort of insight from this is that, corporate legacy media play a central role in this. They play a central role in these smear campaigns. They are obviously utilized, weaponized, co-opted, whatever phrase you want to use, by authorities. And in this situation, obviously, I sort of identified some of the links that you can see. But they're a key part of this mechanism. Push people onto the front pages of a newspaper. The university will maybe start to put pressure on the academics, or the academics will just be scared about their own prospects for promotion, etc. The fourth thing is that, this was a huge attack on us. The Times, I've never heard anything of quite that scale, of quite so many academics ending up on the front page of a newspaper in that fashion and so on. But the scale of the attacks, I think, are strongly indicative that the authorities were trying to hide something. Haven't had time to go into all of the details, But there are some very, very dark secrets. Douma, as I mentioned, 43 civilians were killed in Douma. And all of the evidence that we have indicates that they were killed not by a chemical attack carried out by the Syrian government. They were probably killed by actors on the ground, and those actors on the ground were operating in context or in close proximity to, for example, James LeMessurier and so on. So there are some very, very serious questions to be answered certainly by the British authorities and so on. And the final point, although, as I said, the authorities continue to double down, but then myself and Hans and Richard Falk and Pestein, we carry on pushing on with this issue. Truth is a daughter of time, not of authority, Bacon quote. This stuff does come out in the end, and it will come out in the end, the full story of what's been going on in Syria. So we will hold our ground and continue. So that is the story, or that is at least part of the story of the Working Group in Syria Propaganda and Media, a case study in smearing and character assassination to try and silence academics, which fortunately has not succeeded.